On May 19th, 2024, the VA made significant changes to the rating schedule for GERD. In this video, we're going to cover the old rating criteria, the new rating criteria. We'll discuss why VA made these changes, and most importantly, we're going to talk about how these changes might impact you if you're already service connected for GERD or you're looking to make a claim for GERD. My name is Greg. I'm a VA disability attorney, an Air Force veteran, and I've been practicing VA disability law for over a decade.
I'm Victoria, Greg's partner, and I appreciate you being here today. We haven't released a video in quite a while. We actually took some time off and went to Africa to climb Kilimanjaro. It was wonderful, but honestly, we're both really excited to be back in routine and looking forward to filming a video today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Greg, why don't you start with talking about what the old criteria for GERD was, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So prior to this rating change in May of this year, 2024, VA actually did not have specific rating criteria for GERD. Instead, they had a diagnostic code for hiatal hernia, and they would rate GERD by analogy to the diagnostic code for hiatal hernia.
When you say they would rate it by analogy, what does that mean?
So the VA rating schedule is a regulation, and it has a giant list of diagnostic codes that correspond to various disabilities. And as you can imagine, there might not be a diagnostic code for every single medical diagnosis. And so when the rating schedule doesn't have a diagnostic code for your specific disability, VA is required to rate it by analogy to the closest diagnostic code that they have.
Okay, so hiatal hernia is closely related to GERD, or the symptoms overlap, or can you explain what hiatal hernia is?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's similar. So hiatal hernia is when your stomach actually pushes up into your chest. It's a separate, distinct medical diagnosis from GERD itself.
Okay.
And so some people with hiatal hernia will have GERD because stomach pushing up in your chest can cause GERD symptoms, but not always. So they are different things, but they are similar-ish, or they result in similar symptoms.
Okay. And so now there's a separate specific diagnostic code for GERD.
Correct. Yeah. So the update in May is that VA actually created a diagnostic code for GERD and gave it very specific rating criteria. And so now we can go over the old rating criteria. So as you can see here, this is how VA previously rated GERD. This is the diagnostic code for hiatal hernia.
Mhm.
And you'll see that you could get three possible ratings: a 60% rating, a 30% rating, or a 10% rating. It is also possible to get a 0% rating.
Do you know what the 0% rating symptoms would be?
So 0% is if you don't meet the criteria for 10.
Okay. And so this is prior to May 2024.
Correct.
Okay.
So a lot of people will be familiar with this if you're already service connected for GERD. The most common ratings that we see are 30% or 10%. You can see the 60% rating requires symptoms of pain, vomiting, material weight loss, and hematemesis or melena with moderate anemia. I know I'm butchering those, but hematemesis is vomiting blood. Melena is black tarry stool caused by internal bleeding. So you can see that it was pretty difficult to get those ratings. There is a catch-all on that. It does say or other symptom combinations productive of severe impairment of health. But generally, most people would get a 10% or 30%. The 30%'s easier, although it is a little unclear. So you have to have persistently recurrent epigastric distress with dysphagia, which is difficulty swallowing, pyrosis, which is burning feeling in your chest or throat, and regurgitation, accompanied by substernal, which is chest or arm or shoulder pain. And it has to be productive of considerable impairment of health. The one thing I didn't like about this criteria is there's not a good definition of what impairment of health is. And so under the 60%, it's severe impairment, 30%, it's considerable impairment. So it's kind of wishy-washy, which for attorneys is good because it gives you more room to argue.
Mhm.
But it was always difficult to quantify what that means. And then you'll see The 10% rating is when you have two or more symptoms from the 30% evaluation of less severity.
Okay. So now can we share what the new criteria is and go over the changes?
All right, so now we have pulled up the new rating criteria for GERD. You'll see it gets its own diagnostic code 7206 for gastroesophageal reflux disease, aka GERD, GERD. And you'll see the rating criteria has completely changed from you can now get, now it shows a 0% rating, which you could always get before. There's a 10%, 30, 50, and an 80% rating. The biggest takeaway from this change is that to get a compensable rating, so 10% or more for GERD, you're going to have two things. You're going to have a documented history of esophageal strictures as well as dysphagia.
You mentioned before what dysphagia was, but can you, I mean, actually explain both esophageal strictures and dysphagia?
Yeah, so esophageal stricture is a narrowing of your esophagus, aka your swallowing tube. And I think that's just a funny term, your swallowing tube. And dysphagia again is difficulty swallowing.
Okay. So without one of those, then you're not getting compensation under
Exactly. So if you look at 10, 30, 50, 80, every single one has that requirement. So documented history of esophageal strictures to control dysphagia. Same
Mhm.
thing 30, same thing 50, causing dysphagia, same thing at 80.
Okay. What does a documented history mean?
Yeah, so you can see down below here, VA puts all these notes explaining the criteria in more detail. And a documented history means that the findings of your stricture, the narrowing of your swallowing tube, have to be documented by a barium swallow, computerized tomography, and I'm going to butcher this, or an esophagogastroduodenscopy. Basically, there has to be objective evidence that your swallowing tube, your esophagus, has narrowed.
Okay.
This is going to make it much more difficult to get a rating for GERD because previously you didn't need objective evidence of your symptoms. You could go to your doctor, you could say, I have heartburn, I have difficulty swallowing, I get chest pain,
Mhm.
I get regurgitation when I lie down after eating. The food starts to come back up, and that would be good enough.
Mhm.
But now you're literally going to have medical procedures to prove that your esophagus has a
More narrow.
stricture,
Yeah.
and you can see, going through these rating criteria. So if you just have a documented history without daily symptoms or requiring for medications, you get 0.
Mhm.
To get 10%, you have to have the documented history that requires medications to control the difficulty swallowing.
Mhm.
To get a 30% rating, you have to have a documented history of recurrent esophageal strictures causing dysphagia, which requires dilation at least once a year. So it says no more than 2 times a year. So you at least have to have it once a year. And dilation is a medical procedure where they go in, usually with a balloon, and they stretch out your swallowing tube.
Right.
So this is just really tough for vets to get ratings now. Continuing up through the rating schedule to get a 50% rating, it gets even more difficult. So recurrent or refractory esophageal strictures. So refractory means that they are unable to fix it, causing difficulty swallowing, which requires at least one of the following. So one of the following is dilation 3 or more times a year, dilation using steroids at least once per year, or actually getting a stent placed in your esophagus, which is a medical device that basically props open your esophagus.
I don't understand when you say refractory means they're unable to fix it. They're unable to fix all of these strictures, right? I mean, one if you have a narrow swallowing tube and they're able to stretch it out from time to time, I don't understand what the fix is ever.
Yeah, I mean it's not really a fix. You can see down here in note 5 is how they define refractory. So in general, refractory means that the condition that you have is not responsive to treatment. And so VA is defining refractory as refractory to treatment in the context of GERD as a stricture and the inability to achieve the target diameter despite receiving no fewer than 5 dilation sessions performed at 2-week intervals.
Okay. So with some strictures, people can go in for a dilation, get it stretched out, and it stays open enough for them to consider it fixed.
Exactly. Like you get your target
Okay.
diameter for 3 months,
Okay.
or, and then so you only have to do this 4 times a year.
Mhm.
They consider that working.
Okay.
This refractory is hard, like it says, every 2 weeks you'd have to do it for, you'd have to do 5 sessions every 2 weeks.
Mhm.
And only then, if it doesn't stay for more than that, it's considered a refractory.
Okay.
And then the 80% criteria, again, even more difficult. Documented history of everything with at least one of these symptoms present, which is aspiration, undernutrition, substantial weight loss as defined by section 4.112A, if you want to look that up. And then you also have to have treatment with other surgical correction, or, going to butcher this, percutaneous esophago-gastrointestinal tube, a PEG tube, essentially a feeding tube.
Okay.
So, extreme, extreme case to get that.
Right. Or but before there was no way to get an 80% rating.
Right.
So now there's a higher rating that you can achieve, but it's in the event you have a feeding tube or
Yeah.
another serious surgery.
It's
Okay.
gonna be extremely rare, only for the most severe cases.
Right. Okay. So those are the changes. Why? What was the purpose? Why did VA do this?
Yeah, so we went into the Federal Register, which is always a great read when VA makes these changes. You can see why VA is proposing it, and then every time VA changes a regulation, they have to give a comment period
Mhm.
where people give their input, stakeholders, representatives, doctors, veterans. They can ask VA questions. They can make suggested changes before the regulation becomes final. So, if you're into that kind of stuff, it's always an interesting read because it gives a lot of detail about exactly why VA did things with their regulation changes. But, as far as this and, pretty much any regulation change involving the changing of rating criteria, VA says that the purpose of the change is to reflect medical and scientific advances in understanding and treating digestive disorders. And so they're making these rating changes based on updated medical information, and also the overall goal of the VA disability program, the VA rating schedule, is to compensate veterans for a loss in earnings capacity. The
Mhm.
primary goal is VA gives disability compensation if you have disabilities that impact your ability to work and earn a living.
Mhm.
And so they felt that the prior rating criteria more reflected a quality of life as opposed to functional impairment. And so, what they're saying is they want more objective standards on how exactly the disability manifests, how it impacts someone's ability to earn a living.
Yeah, reading through those comments, there was this common theme of the prior criteria just wasn't objective enough, and the quality of life standard was this really subjective, depending on who's evaluating this. Can come up with all sorts of different outcomes, whereas the current new criteria is just much more identifiable.
Yeah, there's always a push to like make things like identifiable, qualitative,
Uh huh.
objective as opposed to subjective, which I'm not a big fan of because it makes my job harder. It makes it difficult for veterans to get ratings.
Right.
There's less wiggle room when assigning a rating. But at the same time, I love to hate on VA, but I understand where they're coming from. It's tough to like come up with ratings like for everyone, and like how does this really impact your earnings capacity and assign a number to it.
And I think too, it's really easy to almost lose sight of what the regulations are there for. For me, especially when I'm speaking to veterans every day, my focus is how these symptoms are impacting their life and not necessarily their ability to earn income. And that's like the instinct in a lot of people. So if you're looking at it from that lens, then it's a little easier to understand these changes, albeit these, like you said, do make it harder for vets to get higher ratings for GERD. But on that, can we talk about the folks that already have GERD ratings that were rated before May of 2024 and what this means for them?
Yeah. So anytime VA changes the rating criteria for disability and you already have a rating under the old criteria, you are not impacted at all. You keep the rating you have. VA can't reduce it because they changed the rating schedule. So you're good to go. One of the areas I get a lot of questions about is what if you have a claim going during the rating change? So I'll just give an example. Like December 2023, before this GERD change went into effect, you had made a new claim for service connection for GERD, and then your claim spans over the May 19th date, and VA issues a decision in June of 2024. The question I get asked is VA supposed to rate it under the old criteria or the new criteria? And the answer is pretty straightforward, but you are entitled to whichever criteria is more favorable to you, with the caveat that if the new rating criteria is more favorable, you can only get that new rating criteria from the date of the change forward. Does that make sense? So going back to this December example, you made a claim before the rating criteria change, it spanned over the rating criteria change, and you got a decision after the rating criteria change. If the old criteria is more favorable, you're going to be rated under that old criteria for the entire claim period and going forward. If the new rating criteria is more favorable, you can only get that new rating criteria from the date of the regulation change. So you'll be rated under the old criteria up until May 18th of 2024.
Mhm.
And then from the date of the regulation change, May 19th, 2024, you're rated under the more favorable new criteria for the rest of the claim period and going forward. So, in conclusion, the new rating criteria for GERD is going to make it much more difficult for veterans to get higher ratings for GERD or even a rating at all.
Mhm.
Make sure you like and subscribe because we'll keep you updated on all these regulation changes. There is an also regulation change for IBS that we're going to cover in the near future. And then a huge regulation change that everyone's been talking about is a regulation change for PTSD and other mental health disorders,
Right.
which is going to be going into effect sometime at the end of this year or early 2025.
So as soon as the new mental health criteria goes into effect, we'll do a video on that. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.